Hello and welcome to Lesson 7. So this will be our final lesson on the Victorian period. Similar to the previous lesson, our four authors are going to be a poet who wrote short lyric poetry. Then we'll look at a long poem, this time by Christina Rossetti, sister of Dante Gabriel Rossetti, whose long poem we looked at last time. Then a play, and finally a work of fiction. The majority of these writers will be late Victorian writers, and we will use them as a way to discuss the changes, shifts, and transitions happening at the end of the Victorian period and set up the larger transition we'll make all the way into the 20th century with the next lesson. We're also going to look at the Victorian context of the issue of the woman question, which is basically gender roles during the Victorian period and how Victorian society openly talked about the role of women. We're going to come back to the theme of empire as well, though, in the final part of the lesson. If you look at the Victorian period, gender and empire are probably the two most prominent, most important issues. The development of science and crisis of faith education as well would be right up there. But I don't think any two issues have predominated Victorian studies more than gender and empire. And with the final piece of literature, Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes story, we'll see the connection between those two. First, though, we're going to look at Gerard Manley Hopkins, who primarily wrote short lyric poetry. Hopkins provided some really unique new approaches to composing poetry that are still influential today, which is the main reason why we're going to study him, in addition to the fact that he just wrote some really beautiful poems. A little bit of background on Hopkins. He was not recognized for his poetical achievements during his lifetime. None of his poems were even published until 1918, when his executor of his estate finally decided to submit them for publication. This is one of the reasons that he was originally considered a modern author. The editors of the textbook they even go so far as to point out in his introduction that he was, in earlier editions of the Norton Anthology, he was actually grouped in the modern period, the 20th century period. And in terms of his poetic style, he is, in terms of style, a much more modern poet, in that he was quite experimental with meter and diction. However, it is important to resituate him and study him as a Victorian author, because the cultural context to which he was responding as a poet is the Victorian context. So even if he uses these modernist types of innovations in his poetry was really born of the Victorian period. And we've talked about how important cultural context is to studying an author. You might be asking at this point, in what ways was the Victorian cultural context particularly important to Hopkins? Because he was a writer who very much lived and wrote in isolation, with no one even other than himself even reading his poetry until the 20th century. Was primarily the crisis in faith. Hopkins was an incredibly devout religious man, and so studying his poetry can help give us greater depth of understanding on the Victorian crisis of faith and religion and Christianity throughout the Victorian period. Our next author in the lesson, Christina Rossetti, will do that as well. So Hopkins' religious life began to be shaped by his time at Oxford. When he was at university, he was exposed to both secular and religious Victorian ways of thinking. He actually studied under Walter Pater there, which might surprise you because you've seen the lecture on Oscar Wilde, so you know about Walter Pater's theories, even if you haven't read Pater. And Pater was the leader of the aesthetic movement, and his philosophies diverge greatly from Christianity. But what I think you'll see in Hopkins is a merging of an aesthetic approach, a celebration of life in nature, a merging of an aesthetic celebration with a Christian viewpoint. What's key for Hopkins is understanding that he believes any part of creation is God's creation and has a divine stamp on it. And that's how he reconciles the aesthetic view with the Christian one. He was further influenced by other thinkers while at Oxford, including John Henry Newman, and based on his interactions with John Henry Newman, entered the Roman Catholic Church in 1866 and actually became a Jesuit priest, which is the same Catholic order that Gonzaga University here in Eastern Washington follows. Um, but this choice resulted in a very painful estrangement from his family. As you may know, if you're familiar with the religious history of England, which we probably should have talked about in more detail, the Anglican Church in England is very similar to the Catholic Church, but the Anglican Church is technically Protestant because of the moves made by Henry VIII when he founded the Anglican Church and broke with Roman Catholicism in order to obtain a divorce. And so the Anglican Church was really founded as a means for Henry VIII to get a divorce, and in most ways, except for that one aspect, is more similar to Roman Catholicism than to evangelical type of Protestantism you typically see in the U.S. And so that's an important distinction to be aware of. But following that break with the Roman Catholic Church, Catholics experienced a good deal of prejudice in English society for centuries, really. It would vary to what degree under what monarch. Some were more friendly than others. But the Jesuit order in particular, because there are many different orders of Catholic priests, experienced a great deal of prejudice during the Victorian period. And Hopkins' family were part of the Anglican Church, so this led to a very painful estrangement from his family. This painful estrangement from his family deeply affected Hopkins, so much so that scholars cite it as one of the influences on the period of his life where he composed what are called the Terrible Sonnets. The poem Carry On Comfort from our current reading selection is one of the Terrible Sonnets. Hopkins didn't outright experience a crisis in faith. I don't think he ever lost his faith like Tennyson or some of the other Victorians. But this was the Terrible Sonnet period was a period of definitely questioning and struggle for him. And scholars cite the estrangement from his family as one of the factors that influenced that period. He really became deeply invested in his religion to the point that he renounced many personal satisfactions, including writing poetry. That his superiors in the church actually encouraged him to resume writing it. So that's how he got back into poetry. During the period in which he was not writing poetry, he came up with ideas for new experimental approaches to poetry. And the first poem he wrote after resuming his work is called The Wreck of the Deutschland. It's a quite interesting poem. It's not in our textbook, but I highly recommend you read it. It's based on a true story of a shipwreck with 5 Franciscan nuns who died. It gets into the psychology of the people aboard the ship and what's happening. It's quite fascinating. But his methods were so experimental that the one publisher to whom he sent it, although that publisher was fascinated by the poem, thought it was too experimental to publish. And so that one encounter led Hopkins to the decision to not submit any of his poetry for publication. And that's why no one saw any of it until 1918. Were some of these innovative methods that he used? There's 3 main things Hopkins did that separated him from the other poets of his day and that make him someone still worth studying. And these contributions are called endscape, in stress, and sprung rhythm. Inscape and in stress are related and have to do with the content of the poem. So inscape is the distinctive design that constitutes individual identity. So everyone, everything, not just people, animals as well, every being has something unique or distinctive about them, and that's their inscape. And stress is the recognition of the inscape of other beings. So one being looks at another person or another creature and recognizes how that other being is also unique and distinctive, and then has some kind of an experience um, with that other being based on this recognition. The textbook describes that experience as an intense thrust of energy toward the other being that enables one to realize its specific distinctiveness. So the realization of the other being's distinctiveness is not a small or insignificant moment. Although it could be an ordinary moment, it does occur quite frequently, but it's quite important. And so here's how Hopkins then reconciles this very aesthetic thing going on here to his Christian world. So these two things, inscape and in stress, eventually lead one to Christ. Because this individual identity, this distinctiveness, is the stamp of divine creation on it. Remember, I already mentioned that we're all unique. We each have our own special distinctiveness, but that comes from God. That's how Hopkins reconciles the aesthetic and the divine. In the act of in stress, therefore, when it's happening, the human being becomes a celebrant of the divine. So we're celebrating what God has done when this in stress takes place. At once recognizing God's creation, so we see how someone else is distinctive, and then by experiencing in stress, by having that moment with them, interacting with them, we also enact our own God-given identity. So God has made us special, unique in some way. We see the uniqueness of someone else, and through that interaction, we celebrate um, the glory of God as evidenced in the uniqueness of both ourselves and another. Would be the best way to put that. So poetry for Hopkins enacts the celebration. These moments of end stress primarily happen in poetry, at least for Hopkins. And he uses a number of very unconventional poetic devices in order to depict this end stress. Movements of the brain in these moments would be another way to describe what Hopkins is trying to depict in poetry. So disruption of conventional syntax, meaning punctuation, coining and combining of words. So he makes up new words, he combines words. And as you probably saw when you were reading the poems, there are a number of just odd words, old words, not commonly used words that the editors of the textbook actually had to provide definitions for those on the side. Repetition, and then ellipsis. Ellipsis is leaving out words. And so when there's a very intense moment of end stress, he likes to put those two words together with some word that would normally connect them missing because he wants to fuse them together even more intensely. So Hopkins say is more like Browning than Tennyson in that he has a very specific poetical theory, and he places that poetical theory as more important than just beautiful language. And so his poems can be difficult to read, can be challenging to read, and they're not always just this beautiful language that you see in someone like Tennyson, for instance, but there's a really specific purpose behind it. And if you read the poem closely and suss out its meaning, it can be quite powerful and impactful. Finally, we'll talk about sprung rhythm, which, as these other things have been mainly content related, sprung rhythm has to do with the reading of the poem. Sprung rhythm is the rhythm of the poem, and it's designed to imitate the rhythm of natural speech, so to sound much more natural than poetry typically does, right? Poetry, like Tennyson's, is usually this very flowery language. With Hopkins, it's meant to be much more natural. And so if you take an intro to poetry, as you should have before this class, you learned about scansion. And scansion is where you count the number of syllables for poetic feet and look at which syllables are stressed or unstressed. And so, for instance, iambic pentameter, which most sonnets use, is the most common type of poetic structure. In an iambic pentameter, you have 10 syllables, 5 feet per line. So each foot of poetry is 2 syllables. So every line in a sonnet that follows iambic pentameter is 10 syllables. And then it would, be either stressed, unstressed, or unstressed, stressed, and follow that pattern. Hopkins, though, where he deviates with sprung rhythm is instead of counting syllables, he counts the number of stressed syllables. So, for instance, he mostly writes sonnets, and the poem we're going to look at in a minute, The Windhover, is a sonnet. But what he does is instead of counting syllables, he counts stresses. So in iambic pentameter in the sonnet, there should be 5 stresses per line, 10 syllables per line. What Hopkins does is he still has 5 stressed syllables, but he may have 11 syllables or 12 syllables or 9 syllables, depending on what he's trying to convey with that moment of end stress. So, for instance, in The Windhover, he's depicting the movements of this bird. And so he has more or less than 10 syllables in certain lines because he's trying to describe the movement of the bird. So as it's moving or hovering, the lines will move slower or faster. You always have 5 stresses, so it's not free verse. There's still a structure to it, but it deviates from the traditional structures and has this very experimental sprung rhythm. But what you get with that is a poem that's still structured and that actually depicts the movements of this bird as well as the movements of the speaker's heart, and then you get this end stress. So in sprung rhythm, it's not widely used, but it's still used today. So, and it's not necessarily something he invented. He cited earlier traditions, Old English ballads, and said no one had just never really given it a name, and then he gave it a name. But let's move on and take a look at how these things play out in one of his poems, The Windhover. So here is a kestrel falcon, which is a windhover, which is a bird that actually has the ability to hover in the air in one spot, almost like a helicopter, look for its prey, and then dive down to get its prey, which is very unique. Most raptors, most birds of prey have this great vision. They fly through the sky, they see their prey, they dive down to get it. That's what marks birds of prey as distinctive. But within the birds of prey family, you have the kestrel falcon or the windhover, which is actually able to hover in one spot like a helicopter, and that makes it really distinct. So for Hopkins, that ability to hover is the distinctiveness, again, from God that gives the kestrel falcon or the windhover its endscape. And in this poem, you have a speaker who sees the falcon doing this and then has a moment of end stress with the falcon, and that leads him to following Jesus Christ. So we'll look at this poem over the next few minutes, finish out the lesson, and see how Hopkins' poetic theory plays out in one of his poems. I've chosen The Windhover because I think it best depicts this poetical theory, but all of Hopkins's poems are really great. So I encourage you to read the others, to write about the others, and if you're interested in the darker periods of his life that were more like periods of struggle, you can look at Carrion Comfort or the other terrible sonnets in the book. But right now, let's take a look at The Windhover. I'm going to try my best to read it with his timing. It reflects the sprung rhythm. But I'm probably not going to do that well. That's not my strength. So I recommend you also look it up on Poetry Foundation or YouTube and listen to more of a professional reader read it out loud. I caught this morning's minion king, dumb of daylight's dauphin dappled dondron falcon in his riding, of the rolling level underneath him steady air and striding. High there how he rung upon the rein of a wimpling wing. So the phrase I caught, the opening line there, immediately means this is a moment of end stress. You have the speaker seeing the falcon. Now I caught sounds like he may have like captured the falcon or something. So this is where Hopkins uses those kind of abstract words or phrases. All he means here is he sees the falcon. But why not just say, I saw this morning's morning minion king? Well, it's a very significant moment for the speaker because it's this moment of end stress. So he already kind of elevates the moment by saying, I caught rather than I saw. And he's seeing the distinctiveness of this bird, its ability to hover in place. In his riding of the rolling level underneath him, steady air and striding, high there how he rung upon the rein of a wimpling wing. So he compares the control a rider on horseback has to the control this bird is physically exerting. But it's a bird just there in the air. It's not a human rider on a horse with a saddle. So this is very clearly God has made this bird in a very distinct way. The rest of the first stanza. And as ecstasy then off on swing, as a skate heel sweeps smooth on a bow bend, the hurl and gliding, rebuff the big wind, my heart in hiding, stirred for a bird, the achieve of the mastery of the thing. So here we have the transition from the bird hovering in place to whoosh, it's off and it's movement. So you have this suspended energy, concentrated energy, goes into action. That's an important transition. The bird moves from his perch of hovering and flies. And so here he's compared to a skater rather than a horse rider. And he matches and then eventually rebuffs the wind. So it's this very powerful creature, and what's important is its forward motion. I didn't do a good job of reading the poem, but the sprung rhythm here is supposed to indicate the forward motion. You then have the end stress, the connection between the speaker and the bird. That comes back at the end of the stanza, which it began at the beginning of the stanza. You have the description of the bird's movements. Then you have a return to the speaker, the poem at the end of the stanza. So the speaker's heart moves the way in which the bird moves. So it's initially in hiding, but then it stirred for a bird. He sees the mastery of the bird. So he sees the bird's endscape, its distinctiveness, the distinctive way God has made that. And that's a powerful moment of end stress for the speaker. It then the bird stirs his heart. He moves his heart out of hiding. So his movements of his inner soul or heart match the physical movements of the bird. That's this moment of end stress for the two of them. The next stanza is just 3 lines. Brute beauty and valor and act, O air, pride, plume, here, buckle. In the fire that breaks from thee then a billion times told lovelier, more dangerous, O my chevalier. So a couple of really important words here. Brute, that has kind of a negative connotation to us today. Here it just means nature, part of nature. Again, Hopkins using kind of abstract words to get at what he means. And the word buckle, that's the most important word here. Think of buckling a belt. It's a coming together. It means unity. So you have 3 different aspects of the bird: his physical body, his will, what the bird wants to do, and then his action. So you have, physical body, you have the mind controlling it, and then you have the body put into motion or action. What Hopkins is saying here is you see a bird fly, and it's this everyday, ordinary kind of a thing. But then you think about all that has to happen for a bird to fly: its body, its will, and its action. All have to work together for it to actually fly. That's pretty impressive, is what Hopkins is saying. And that is in accordance with God's will. That's showing what God has created. The speaker, like the bird, also moves. He takes inspiration from the bird's perfectly self-contained, self-reflecting action. He sees the speaker's heart isn't hiding. He's not completely committed to his purpose or his goal, but this bird is. When he sees the bird not hesitating, when he sees the bird's body, will, and action all work in conjunction, he is similarly spurred to action. Then you have this fire that breaks free. So what the bird is doing is so powerful. According to Hopkins, he compares it to a powerful fire. And this takes us to the last line of the stanza, which brings us to the connection to Christ. He compares the fire evoked by the bird, similar to the type of fire evoked when through Christ's life and crucifixion. And so that line, "Oh my chevalier," yeah, which references a chevalier as a knight, that's the reference to Christ. And so something very glorious is happening here that shows God's will and God's sovereignty, according to Hopkins. And it's similar to, though certainly not on equal footing with, that's why you have a billion times told lovelier, Christ's life and crucifixion. And so for devout Christians who follow Hopkins's train of thought, God is sovereign, and Christ's crucifixion is the culmination of a perfect plan that God set into motion before the beginning of time. So the bird's body, will, and action all functioning perfectly together is similar to how God has this perfect plan laid out, where there would be fall, creation, fall, redemption, like we've talked about before, how it comes together and culminates with Christ. So what the bird does is certainly not equal to that, but it points to that, gestures to that, and that's part of what inspires the speaker. Finally, we'll look at the last stanza. No wonder of its sheer plod makes plough down Sicilian, shine in blue bleak embers, ah, my dear, fall, gall themselves in gash gold vermilion. I probably should have read that slower. Hopkins is slowing down here to appreciate the connection to Christ. If you listen to the poem on Poetry Foundation, you'll hear it slower. I'm caught up in trying to get to the lesson for you. So that first line, no wonder of it, indicates that this isn't, even though this is a glorious, amazing thing, it's an everyday thing. It's part of everyday life. There's no wonder of it. But we've seen all this wonder so far. So what's the speaker doing here? He's saying that shows even more how great God is, that these wonderful things are part of everyday life. Coming back to the speaker of the poem here, since his heart stirs, moves into action, what is he doing? It's spiritual striving. So the bird has a purpose. His purpose is to hover, then find prey, and then fly, which is what we see the bird do in the first stanza. It's distinctively created by God to do that specific thing. What is the human being created by God to do? To worship God. And so the speaker may have been having some kind of mini crisis of faith or something, I'm not sure what, but his heart was hiding and then it stirred into action. So he's now striving to seek God, to glorify God, because that's his purpose. Just as the bird's purpose is to hover, find prey, and fly. This striving, seeking to glorify God, could sound exhausting, but it's not, because it's part of everyday life. We may struggle with it, as many Victorians did, but it should come as naturally to us as the motions of the bird. And if we do it through God, then we have an inner glow, the blue bleak embers. Those emerge. And he compares it to a plow. So you use a plow, it doesn't get worn down, it actually shines it, polishes it using a plow. And so if the bird flies, we see God's glory through its glory. If we pursue God, according to Hopkins, we see God's glory through us. A fire ignites inside us when we pursue God. The final line brings this idea back to Christ. Basically, the fall, gall, and gash. The word gash references the crucifixion, and the gold vermilion, Christ's blood, gold because he's perfect. But what that's really saying is it's a religious life. It's following Christ, following God that brings out our inner fire, um, rather than anything else. Is why he has that allusion in the last line. So as you can see, Hopkins was a very devout man, and his poetry really reflects that. But he uses these really unique, interesting, specific, dare I say, experimental types of things that he developed in order to depict this. And so we have that contribution from him. And whether or not you agree with his beliefs, I think how he works through them and the poetry is absolutely fascinating. And that makes him one of my favorite poets. So I hope you enjoyed reading him.